We are back on the same journey of faith, which we started last year. And we had 4 sessions interspersed with a lot of other subjects that we took up for discussion and mutual enlightenment and entertainment. All the 4 sessions were really the discussants or the speakers were from our own fraternity, most of them from our own cadre, and one came, of course, from a sister cadre from UP. I think Qureshi is from UP, isn't it? Anyway, but for this important religion or faith, we couldn't really spot anybody in our fraternity. And thereby hangs a tale, or let's say a question. Why is it that we don't have any Buddhists around us, though they are mentioned as a religious minority in the constitution? In our daily life, we don't see anybody. In our work life, in our friend circle, the only Buddhist or a monk whom we found with us was at the academy 50 years ago, or 60. And that happened to be a delegate or a deputationist from Bhutan, because they sometimes send their people for administrative training at the National Institute. That is all that we saw of a Buddhist in our midst. And as I had mentioned in my mail, this is strange when you consider that this is the land of nativity for Buddhism. Of course, I don't know. That's another one of the question areas, whether in all countries where Buddhism is practiced and is living, thriving, the same legends, the same stories about nativity, etc., that we believe, is it the same everywhere, or there are other tales and fables about the birth of the Buddha? But as I said, we do not have too many Buddhists around us. And for that, there is a certain history on which a lot of debate has been going on the email circuit in the past few days. And that's interesting. But since we did not have internal resources, we went out to a friend who is present here, that is Rajiv Mehrotra. He is a very special person, a man of many accomplishments and truly sterling credentials. He is from the universities of Delhi, Oxford, and Columbia. And after that, he's been writing books, making films, I think taking part in plays. And he straddles many worlds. He's been frequently seen at the World Economic Forum and also in interfaith conclaves. So both the world of dharma as well as earth. I don't know what he does for karma and moksha. Okay. He's, for the today's talk, he's uniquely qualified because for the past several years, he has been a devotee and a student of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, whose foundation he's serving on as an honorary trustee. His, as I said, many accomplishments, but there are too many to count, so I'll not go into those things. And I'm also privileged to recognize the presence of Meenakshi Gopinath, who is the better half of the best man that we have today. I don't know of the two who is more decorated. Meenakshi ji was the principal of the Lady Shri Ram College in Delhi for long years, maybe 10, 15, 16 years. And she has been the recipient of a Padma Award. And of course, she's working on various things relating to women, women in security situations, and various things. And in some of those things, she probably shares the forum with Rajiv ji, because that's also part of the foundation's work area, as I understand it. So without much ado, I think I will just say Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, and I'll hand over the flock to our shepherd today, Mr. Rajiv Mehrotra.
Namaskar and thank you, Makija Sab. I'm sorry I gave you a few anxious moments. It was a struggle with technology, and I kept trying to log in and couldn't get through to you. But it is indeed a deep, profound privilege to be speaking to such a distinguished collection of people. And I've had some wonderful conversations with Makija, and have already learned.
I'm just muting all and then unmuting Mr. Mehrotra because I can hear some background noise. Excuse me for just a second. You may unmute yourself, Mr. Mehrotra. Ji.
Yes, all set. So just to go back, that my deep gratitude and appreciation to you, Makija Sahab, for making it possible for me to offer some reflections on Buddhism and my journey, and my guru, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who has deeply blessed me, a most unworthy aspirant, with some of his time and his wisdom. I'll just plunge straight in, and what my attempt will be to give you a sort of a brief overview of some of the key elements of the Buddhist enterprise, and then respond to questions. I already have some wonderful questions from Mr. Makija and Mr. Jambunathan, who I also see on the screen. I think it's always preferable and useful to respond to questions rather than hold forth on what I think you might find useful. And I think the starting point really is to recognize that Prince Siddhartha was born a prince and an heir in waiting to become king. In some ways, it's the narrative of many of us when we're young. We're awaiting to fulfill our potential and the possibilities of the future. And so for Siddhartha, it was foretold that he would either be a great king or a great mendicant. And his father had protected him from an exposure to the outside world, and so on and so forth. The story is a very familiar one. And so he steps out of the palace and sees the inherent suffering of the human condition, and he felt impelled to search for an answer on how it could be addressed. And at that very point, it's interesting that he didn't just seek to find an answer to the challenges of the human condition for himself, but he felt that with all the poverty and the struggles that he saw around him, so his motivation was outer directed, to see how he could help all sentient beings, all human beings, to find happiness and avoid suffering. And again, in comparison to sort of most other traditions, he had no dramatic divine revelation that suddenly that he was the chosen one. And for him, it was hard work. He engaged for 6 years in the practices and sadhanas of his times, and he excelled in each one of them. So much so that many of his teachers would, urge him to stay on and pick up their mantle. But he went on because he found that while each one of them addressed some facet of his yearning and seeking, none of them were really complete. They helped, but they were not definitive. So he sat down under the Bodhi tree in deep meditation, determined not to rise till he awakened to the decisive knowledge and realization of the true nature of reality, and hence the way out of suffering. The veils of ignorance had lifted. And then he struggled about what he should do with these experiential transforming insights and wisdom. And what was key to his hesitation was that despite the motivation of wanting to reach out, to share his experience and be able to impact the lives of those around him, it was a non-conceptual experience. It was beyond his capacity to use words. And so the challenge for him was, how could he share these with others and help them? And here emerges another distinction, and that is that traditionally religious philosophies, traditions have been carried forward through millennia, through scripture. But Buddhism has been different. And so when he stepped forth and met his fellow travelers on the path, he first hesitated that could he communicate this? And then he recognized that he had to build in to his teaching the enormous significance, value, and the vitality of method. And that was to encompass Buddhism as it evolved through the ages, that it became a juxtaposition of both method, which drew on India's rich civilizational heritage, and the wisdom. And so he spoke about the Four Noble Truths. This is just a sort of a rushed introduction to this, because I think it places Buddhism in true context. And what were the Four Noble Truths? And he said, well, there is suffering, the fact of suffering. There is an end to suffering. There is a cause of suffering. And the way out is the Eightfold Path. But the first noble truth, there is suffering, ran into trouble in recent times, because when Western translators came out, they interpreted the word he used, dukkha, as suffering. But it was more like dissatisfaction. And it isn't pessimistic as is often believed, because people say, well, Buddhism is very pessimistic. But as a Buddhist, I would argue it was realistic. The Buddha didn't mean that ordinary life is nothing but dissatisfaction, suffering and misery. And of course, there is sukha, or happiness. And that is elaborated decisively in the second truth, and that even happy moments are ultimately unsatisfying because everything changes. And good, bad, or indifferent, nothing lasts. We're all, without exception, subject to aging, sickness, and death, and trying to get what we want and hang on to what we want while avoiding or rejecting what we don't want inevitably leads to disappointment. And ignorance of this reality is the root cause of dukkha. Often it is said that in common parlance, that we suffer because we desire or crave, and that if only we can eliminate desire and craving, we will be happy. And it is the grasping mind that creates dissatisfaction. But it is relative. And what is important is, what is it that we desire? Or like a Buddha, if we desire to serve others, that is an affirmation. That is something positive. So it is in the nature and the kind of desire or the craving that happiness or suffering rests. And then the third noble truth really talked about, there is an end to suffering. And that is the saving grace for many people of the Four Noble Truths. Pain and dissatisfaction are not all there. Just as suffering is the human condition, so too is the possibility of the end of suffering. So the Buddha is often referred to as a physician. And so he looks at the problem, the cause of the problem, reassures us that there is a solution to the problem, and then tells us what it is. And the fourth noble truth really talks about the practical actions we can take towards our own awakening. And the Eightfold Path, proposes several elements that, living ethically, training the mind, and cultivating wisdom. So it's broken up into these in a sense. And so it's right view, intention, speech, action, livelihood, effort, concentration, and meditation. And so these 8 steps are divided into 3 areas: ethical conduct, which is fairly, and then the elements of it are fairly common to most religions, traditions, aspirations for the good life. But somewhat more unique is the practice of meditation, samadhi, and wisdom, prajna. And so as this great physician, he drew on India's heritage for specific mind training techniques that went back, some of them, to his own experience and practice before he sat under the Bodhi tree, seeking decisive wisdom and the method. And so these, what is the purpose of these techniques? And that is really to help deepen our intellectual understanding that may come from scripture or the verbalized teachings, to a realized experiential insight that ultimately transforms our deepest reflexive responses to the situations that life presents. And that is a very, very key inspiring element of the Buddhist tradition. So very often we can read an empowering and energizing scripture, or we can listen to a powerful speaker, be impressed and moved by it, but when and how can it impact us so that the next time we are presented with a crisis or the possibility of anger or negative emotions, which in Buddhism we call kleshas, how can we respond in a manner that is nurturing us and takes us further along the path, to fulfillment and happiness? And it is in this aspect that I think that the genius of the Buddha rests. Now, to sort of look at how this framework is, and why is Buddhism one of the fastest growing religious traditions in the world today, and why are more and more people from different faiths embracing Buddhism. So when the Buddha was dying, and some of his monks around him were weeping, and he asked them and urged them and said that you must submit everything that I have taught, the doctrine and its practices, to reason, logic, and experience. And what he built into that was an evolutionary principle. And that was the teachings of the Buddha did not stop with the Buddha. And they continued through millennia and to this day with teachers like His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who many people consider reincarnation of the Buddhist aspect of compassion. For example, Padmasambhava was considered the second Buddha, and a whole vast retinue of people came by and engaged in the practices that the Buddha taught, improved on them, embellished them, and nuanced them. And those practices yielded a greater in-depth experience of the Four Noble Truths and an understanding of the Four Noble Truths, and nurtured and continues to nurture to this day. So it was carried forward not merely on the words of the Buddha, but the lived experience of the practitioners that followed. And I think a useful example of that will be, what happened to Buddhism when it traveled to Tibet, where many people believe that it was preserved in its purest form. So it wasn't merely Buddhist scripture that traveled to Tibet, but the Buddhist practitioners traveled to Tibet with some of the scriptures and taught and trained their Tibetan students in the practices of their tradition of Buddhism. And so you had this constant juxtaposition of method and wisdom. So what happened in Tibet was that because they were uniquely motivated, in a sense, to receive these teachings and to document them. So while the method was transmitted through teacher, guru to chela, to guru to chela, to guru to chela, and survived to this day, but equally, the Tibetans expanded their vocabulary to try and find as close as possible approximations to the ideas that the Buddha had taught and were experienced by their practitioners. And so that is what is responsible for in some senses, for the continuing authentic access that we have today of the Buddha's teachings. And the Buddha also taught that his teachings were often apparently contradictory because they were articulated and to people with different mental capacities and proclivities. And so in order to assimilate those, what was essentially a non-verbal experience and a non-verbalizable, in a sense, if I may use that word, teaching, the only way to do this was to try and evoke the experience of what that teaching sought to nurture in the individual. And so what were some of the principles first, and I will come to the method in a little bit, and that is more difficult and challenging because you can only point to the method. The method is a long, arduous process of training in wisdom and in concentration and the allied capacities that will enable you to engage in the practice of the method in the first place. So in its presentation to the world today, many of the elements are entirely secular, and they have no relationship to some of the the Buddhist principles of, say, reincarnation that is very central to Buddhist ideas, or belief in God or not believing in God. And we'll come to all that, time permitting, and the questions coming. So the key elements today which hold true for the shared common experience of mankind in some ways is and they sort of build in nurturing the key qualities that the Buddha sought to nurture. And the first one says interdependence. It's a very important concept in Buddhism. And so what does he mean by interdependence? And it's we now know today with what we're seeing around us with the environment, for example. I think someone will have to go mute. Anyway, I'll carry on. And so what is happening is that we are becoming increasingly aware, whether we like it or not, with the heat waves and the tornadoes and the fires, of the interdependence that we have with each other and with our planet. And so we now recognize that our very survival and happiness depend on each other. And quantum theory will tell us and that if a butterfly flaps its wings in the rainforests in Latin America, you can get a storm in Bangladesh. I mean, that is the level of interdependence that we now experience. And of course, we know at a more mundane level, it's not mundane actually, it's very profound, that if someone we know is happy and we're in their presence, and we feel happy together, if we're normal human beings and not feeling jealous. So that, the fact of interdependence. And the second pillar on which it was built was the, as I mentioned when I was talking about the Four Noble Truths, is the fact of impermanence, that everything changes from the height of Mount Everest to the movement of the continents, to our skin tones, to our complexions, to our bodies, to the new car we buy, the new cell phone we are obsessed with. Everything is in a constant state of flux and change. And so this is where, when he was talking about desire and craving, so when we crave for something to be permanent, which is inherently impermanent, like everything else, we are bound to feel dissatisfaction. So this, when I talk about this, the pillars it stands on, these are not, they are particular points of emphasis from the Buddha. They are not particular to the Buddha's insight. He drew attention to these as universal truths. So the Four Noble Truths are not just truths from the Buddha, they are universal truths, which are verifiable from everyday common sense and experience, and not necessarily through the high citadel of science. And the next one is causality, that everything has causes and conditions. And one of my favorite examples is ice cream. And for us to be able to eat the ice cream, there are, of course, causes and conditions that enable the ice cream to be made and manufactured, and a whole change of interdependencies that make it possible. So where does the milk come from? Where does the cream come from? Where does the sugar come from? And if you try to track it, you will you cannot imagine the number of intermediaries that make it possible for it all to come together. From the person who grows the sugar cane, to the sugar factory, to the person who transports it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And finally, to the person who cools it to a temperature that it is ice cream. So it is all these causes that have enabled the ice cream to be ice cream. And so the condition that sustains ice cream is temperature, the coldness of the environment in which it is. But the minute that is no longer cold, there is no longer ice cream, because the cause for the ice cream has shifted and it becomes something else. And so our very existence, from the union of the egg and the sperm of our parents and their impermanence, to our teachers, to what have you, to the air we breathe, the air conditioner I'm sitting in, the Zoom that refused to work for a while and then began to tick away. These are all causalities that are making our interrelatedness possible this evening together. And the final, there are many pillars, but I'm just looking at some of the significant ones, especially the ones that stand up to the dictum of the Buddha, that it must stand up to reason and logic, and nothing needs to be taken on faith. And the final one, which is somewhat more difficult to grasp and understand, and certainly I have struggled with it, and certainly more difficult to internalize, is the idea of shunyata, or often mistakenly described as non-self. And one of the perils that many traditions have had, and certainly Buddhism, was that as Buddhism began to be translated into English, merely a few hundred years ago, and the Western scholars came in, the translations that they used, including such as translating dukkha as suffering, I think one of the great casualties was the idea of shunyata. And so they translated shunyata as emptiness. And if they were being very precise, they would say empty of inherent existence. And it really is merely a description of a quality of phenomena. It is not absence, it is not nothingness. And I will just come to why this idea of shunyata is very, very significant and central. So we, as I pointed out with ice cream, I can just as well, point it out to say, I'm sitting in a room, there's an air conditioner, and the windows have droplets of water on them. And so water vapor has condensed because there is a difference in temperature between outside the room and where I'm sitting. So those droplets of water have causes, so the water vapor, because of certain causes and conditions, has now become drops of water. So everything has a cause and a circumscribing condition for its very existence. And its most powerful expression and as a tool to understanding is understanding the nature of self. And why is understanding the nature of self so seminal? And just as an illustration, that every tradition recommends a softening of the dilution of the self. So if we have in our Hindu Indian tradition, we have bhakti, for example. So what is the goal of bhakti? How does bhakti diminish your sense of suffering? It is that you surrender yourself, your sense of self, to the deity. And the deity takes precedence over the I, me, mine. And incidentally, today's scientific research and data tells us that people who suffer, have mental problems, and go for, say, psychoanalysis or therapy, obsessively use I, me, mine. So it is that obsession with self that forms a central principle and an element in our experience of suffering. And of course, if you look at karma yoga, the yoga of action, of selfless action, again, you're softening yourself to act for the laws of good. So you move away from the self. And of course, Jnana Yoga, because if you understand these elements of knowledge, you will again recognize that it is the self that struggles. And so, the Buddhism tells us, points to the fact that even the self is dependent on causes and conditions. And so there is no independent self. So like every phenomena depends on causes and conditions, the self itself depends on causes and conditions. So the minute, whether through whichever means, I've been recently reading Ramana Maharishi. So Ramana also talks about, what does he recommend? What is his singular meditation? His singular meditation is, ask yourself, who am I? And when you keep looking, the journey on that looking for the self in the Hindu tradition, what ends up with Brahman. And it is the I is merging with the universal self. But the principle of the softening of the I is common to all aspirations, in a sense, to become a human being, to become a better human being, and to achieve what many will call freedom or liberation. The other, and this is where, it for me at least, it begins to get ever more interesting and exciting, that Gandhiji spoke about means and ends, and that the means were as important as the ends. In understanding how our thoughts and actions impact us in our everyday lives, and we all think of karma, and we often hold karma responsible for what may be unfolding on the planet or in our lives. Either you have collective karma, you have individual karma, you have a whole range of karmas. Now, and we believe that karmas are generated by action. And by our actions, good actions lead to good karma, lead to good outcomes. But Buddhism argues that it is not our actions, but it is our motivations. It is the intention behind our actions that determine their implications for us. And so in the context of morality, as we understand it in larger contexts, as in most other traditions, the uniqueness of Buddhism is that the ultimate guiding principle for any action is the motivation. And the ethical principles are merely guidelines till we reach a stage of wisdom where we can discriminate and ensure that our motivation is truly altruistic and compassionate and outer directed. A common example of that is that, we will give charity and then let the whole world know we've given charity. So our action has been one of altruism, but the motivation is to be recognized and applauded for our act of generosity. So, I mean, we would argue that that is counterindicative. So that sort of leads us to sort of understanding how our karma in the Buddhist sense is also not singular. So it is not that a good action leads to a good outcome. It is really good actions, or really a series of motivations that will create a series of overlapping imprints in our consciousness on which we draw to express and manifest subsequent actions. So it's not that one negative action will have an equal and opposite reaction to that particular action. It is the sum total of their interaction, their interconnectedness. So I mean, if you're even if you look at causality in the context of science, you look at a jet airplane and the speed at which it flies, it is dependent on several factors, not just the thrust of the engine, but it is dependent on the design of the aircraft, at what altitude it is flying. So different altitudes, you will get different speeds with the same level of thrust. So it is this aspect of overlapping karmas and actions that leave us to sort of live out our lives. And I think the final one, I mean, there are so many, but let me just, time is running out and I really want to create time for questions, is the idea that that there is no single reality. And why is this important? And then I'll come back what we mean by single reality, is that at a time of so much fragmentation and division between traditions, we like to believe that each one of us is privileged to our own understanding and experience of reality, and that our experience of reality is the only one there is, and it is absolute, final, and accurate. Now, today we know that through chaos theory and quantum theory, that the very nature of reality is dependent on the observer. And it is this understanding that enables someone like the Dalai Lama to go to a mosque and perform the namaz, not rhetorically celebrating all faiths, so that suggesting that all faiths actually preach the same thing, because in some senses they don't, because each religion and tradition has a certain social, cultural origin, which determines what is the most appropriate framework for ethical values, our standards of life and living. But the minute we can understand that there is no absolute reality, and that my reality is valid because it works for me, and your understanding of reality is valid if it works for you. So the realities the different traditions conjure up for their faithful, each of them is valid to the degree that it works for them. And why does this aspect of reality come in? It is because, again, and this is an overlap between many commonalities between the Hindu understanding of religious and spiritual traditions, is that what the process of Buddhist practice and wisdom is doing is that it's lifting the veils of ignorance of the clarity insight that is already within us. And that is why articulating it is so complex and challenging. So Buddhism recognizes that there are, in some senses, two realities. So even when we talk about, say, Maya, or life is an illusion, or samsara, whatever, if I just say everything is Maya, but there is a table in front of me and I run into it, the reality of that is real. So we have to recognize, as I mentioned when I was talking about Shunya, that this table has a reality, but that reality is not frozen and locked in. It is relative to the causes and conditions. And it took me a long time to get myself around it, but I think it's a very key principle. So I'm trying to share my sort of limited understanding of it. And so this pretty much is very broadly the matrix of Buddhism. I mean, other few things to keep in mind is that Buddhism was far more was uniquely assimilated through history in different traditions and cultures, and it did not need to formally assimilate other influences, though that's what it did. So Buddhism in Southeast Asia, Buddhism in the West today, retain these key principles, but for the rest, it is dynamic, it is inclusive, and it is respectful of diversity, it is respectful of diverse realities, it is respectful of diverse truths. Now, I had some questions from Mr. Makija and Mr. I will just take, respond to the ones from Mr. Jambunathan, because I think it just helps pick up from where we are. And so he's asked that, we all understand that unlike Hinduism, there is no faith in the Vedas and no place for idol worship in Buddhism. If so, how is it that we find a plethora of statues, small and big, in all Buddhist temples? So the point is, it is not that there is no place. There is no place in the core articulation of the Buddhist enterprise that I have mentioned. However, the relationship to idols and deities in Buddhism is very different to what it is in Hinduism. In Hinduism, for example, the deity for us is real. We believe the deity to exist, and we worship the deity because it exists and has the capacity to intervene on our behalf. In Buddhism, the deity is created. So in our minds, through causes and conditions, we generate the deity. So when I'm doing a meditation practice, for example, my teacher will give me or assign to me, and in some cases design a deity for me, or tweak an existing form of a deity that is most suitable for my particular psychological mental framework. Now we know that whether it is color, shapes, or forms, when we focus on them, they impact how we respond to it. I mean, there's a different response to the color red than it is to blue. So I'm moving fast, but in the same way, different forms and shapes and different symbols, even though no formal meaning may be assigned to them, impact us differently. I mean, you will see a trishul differently, react differently to a trishul, even if you didn't know what it was about, than to a lotus. There is an inherent quality in the image. So an example that the Buddha often gave is that if you're driving on a road, you didn't drive, then you were going on a bullock cart, and you saw a rope in the dark, and you thought that rope was a snake. For all practical purposes, you will respond to that rope as a snake, and it is a snake for you. No matter how hard I tell you, no, it's not a snake, it's a rope. So similarly, we are creating deities, and it's called the generation stage of practice. So from shunya, the lack of phenomena, we create an image to which we assign these qualities, and then we visualize them. And deities and symbols, whether in paintings and tankas or in temples, are an aid to that process of visualization so that they can impact psycho, reflex, somatic, whatever words you want to use, responses. And it is in that sense that it is somewhat different to the Hindu tradition. And then he goes on, what are the common features and principles between Hinduism and Buddhism which need to be strengthened further? In fact, the definition of Hinduism in the constitution includes Buddhism and Jainism. I think this is the Brahmin enterprise, which has sought to bring back Buddhism to the fold and designated the Buddha as a reincarnation of Vishnu. And there are many, many elements. Buddhism is evolved from Hinduism. And like I said, that many of the practices and techniques that the Buddha practiced before he sat under the Bodhi tree that made his enlightenment possible were from India's civilizational heritage. But there are some distinct differences. One of them is this aspect that I mentioned to you of the deity. The other is of the idea of Atman and no self. That is an extremely complex, and I certainly am not capable of rushing through that. And even at the best of times, I would only struggle to get that across, because it can only be intellectual understanding. As the Hindu part of me, I often talked about the Atman, and I have verbalized what the Atman is, and the continuity of the Atman. So my Atma sitting here today is what manifests. If I take reincarnation, manifest in the next life. So that's the continuity of Atma, or Atma merges into Brahman, etc. But we have not really understood in what form or manner the Atman is in us, or even for that matter, consciousness, mind. At the intellectual level, these are perennial areas of discussion and debate, particularly if we're not willing or able to fall back on scriptural articulations. Because we argue that many often scriptural articulations limit us, because then we parrot what the scriptures say without having internalized and truly experienced or understood what they're saying. So if transformation in the spiritual path was merely learning the scriptures and being able to repeat them without being able to internalize them so that they impact our deepest reflexive responses, we'd all be enlightened by now. So so this is not dodging the question, merely acknowledging that it is certainly beyond my ken, and I have seen His Holiness himself sometimes duck the question, and because there is no easy, simple response. Because the Buddhist idea is, that really looks at, describes it as a subtle mind, and that it is so subtle that it is not anything. And one of the examples is, so what happens in reincarnation? And so it's always an incomplete example, is that if you have two candles and I take this flame and I light the other candle. So this flame has had something to do with this flame, but we cannot entirely say it is the same flame. So it becomes difficult to articulate that, just as the analogy that's often given and wonderfully articulated in Hermann Hesse's book Siddharth is of the river. And that, the river in Gangotri, is it the same river with all the pollution and what have you when it reaches the ocean? It is and it isn't. So I want to duck that, responding to that question any further. And a few remaining minutes on, of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, which Makhijaji has flagged. And he asks, how does the Dalai Lama or Tibetan Buddhism differ from the faith as practiced in other parts of the world? Before I answer the question, just a few questions, because for me, and I think for very large numbers of people around the world, the Dalai Lama embodies the highest aspiration of the spiritual quest. And why does he do that? What are some of the lesser known elements of that? Some of these are that, he is 87 years old now. He still spends what, maybe 5-6 hours a day in practice and sadhana. And so that reaffirms the imperative that sadhana and practice is a lifelong journey. So there is no sudden cataclysmic moment of enlightenment. There is no weekend course to enlightenment. It is hard work that you do over lifetimes. Second aspect, which I've already mentioned, is his amazing ability to be able to embrace as lived experience other faiths and traditions and to learn from them. There's a wonderful friend of mine, Salman Chishti, who's the head of the Dargah in Ajmer. And just last 2 weeks ago, he was telling me how the Dalai Lama went to the Dargah and prostrated, a full prostration with his forehead resting on the shrine of Khwaja Sahib there. And he lay there for 15 minutes and he got up and he said that I have just experienced divine vibrations. And someone would argue, how can an agnostic acknowledge having experienced divine vibrations? But it is a measure of his openness and experience that the world desperately needs to learn from, that an agnostic can legitimately experience divine vibrations and be enriched by it. So it is that willingness to embrace the other that he embodies, and that has, despite all the efforts by the Chinese, or our Indian Prime Minister, wished him a happy birthday. The newspapers reported keeping an eye on China. So there are these sort of interesting nuances that evolve around great men, as they did around Gandhi. And so his there was this other question about what is the hierarchy of the religious order of precedence in other countries where Buddhism is a strong presence. There is no hierarchy. What's interesting is that the Dalai Lama is considered a preeminent monk, not by decree, but by consensus. In fact, he is not even the head of his own sect of Buddhism within Tibet. The Dalai Lama is who he is because of who he is, not merely the office that he holds. And in the highest traditions of sort of evolving religions, traditions, practices, and institutions, more than 10 years ago, he separated the political and spiritual roles that he was playing. So he no longer, talking about precedence, he no longer has anything to do with the political agendas of Tibet, and it is now a democratically elected leader from the Tibetan community in exile who do this. I think I want to stop and listen to some questions, if I may. It's getting boring just speaking with what questions that I read. So, Bakija Sahib, I hope there is a mechanism for people to ask questions, otherwise I'll go on.
No, certain. I'll unmute them now, and they will be free to ask questions in whatever order they want to go about it. So here it is. I think we have had an excellent exposition of a faith which appears so vague and ambiguous and amorphous to us in a very systematic way. At least that's the way I have received this wisdom. Now it's all open to you, whoever wants to take on the batting first. Gopal, you have. Gopal.
Didn't see him. I didn't see him.
Gopal is here, and in one of his rare appearances. Yeah, but come on, whoever wants to.
No, I think let me
yes,
get the ball rolling, as it were. I found the whole lecture somewhat abstract in the sense that I was unable, at least fault is mine, to grasp really what Buddhism really stands for. What are its external, if I may say so, external manifestations. Uh, for example, in the Hindu, we have the deities, we have the temples, we have a certain code and ethic of life, etc., etc. Similarly, if you want to call yourself a Buddhist, what are the specific characteristics that will distinguish you as a Buddhist from anybody else? Embracing other religion, or even not that way, but what are then the core attributes of being a Buddhist?
Well, so there are no core, I mean, the whole point of the Buddhist enterprise is that we are not locked in to any core externalities. And they vary. So a Buddhist monk in Tibet will wear maroon robes. In somewhere else, they'll wear ochre robes. The robes will be even different. There will be some traditions where Buddhist monks will marry. In others, they will not marry. And so, as I mentioned, that this is both, how do I put it? I think for people who seek external symbols, there may be other faiths that are more appropriate. So there are no external symbols. There is only a single core of the Four Noble Truths. And then, depending on individual proclivities and the individual mental diets that people need, Buddhism is so embraced. There is no single ritual or practice or something that you do, like wear a janeu or have a sacred thread around you to sort of send out a mark that you are Buddhist. So there are practices. There is a core Buddhist philosophy and idea that adapts itself to uniquely to every single individual. So the analogy that we're often given is that just as each one of us needs a different physical diet within any community. So if you're diabetic, you cut down your sugar. If you are high blood pressure, you cut down your salt. If you're short in protein, or if you're overweight like I am, then you do something else. So within this framework of the Four Noble Truths, each individual is empowered and trained, and techniques and practices are made available, just like your dietitian or doctor will give you a specific diet. So
thank you, Rajiv. I think that's perfectly okay. Can I ask Shubhangi, who has specially come to meet Rajiv on this forum? Shubhangi?
Hi, hello.
Yes. Shubhangi is Govind Sarup's daughter and an author herself.
Oh my goodness.
Okay.
Yes.
Author to author.
Hi, I'm Shubhangi Swaroop. I'm here. I tagged along because I have been following Mr. Mehrotra for years now. So when my father saw that you are talking here, he graciously extended the invitation. Thank you so much. I've just been absorbing everything that was communicated, and I must say that the simplicity with which you communicated it, I've read many books and it hasn't come through. Even the idea of the deity being our own creation, and as a result, it takes away even the idea of blasphemy, if I may say so, because
Indeed.
there is
No
one
dogma.
yes, no one standing on top of me telling me what it should be. In the pandemic, I really wondered about, if I may ask, it's a bit of a strange question. We wonder what are forms of life and the elements, and somehow science has this big, what do you call it? It has these horse blinds with, how we treat elements or how we even view viruses. And I really wonder how, if Buddhism can help me understand it in a larger entirety with perhaps greater, appreciation of the interconnectedness of things.
Gosh, that's a challenging question.
I mean, we view COVID as our enemy, right? And I just feel like if I understand the philosophy, then I shouldn't view anyone as my enemy, even if it's a virus. I
No,
should.
No, I'll tell you, I don't think that's strictly accurate, because we have an idea, we have a notion, say, of afflictive emotions, which we call kleshas. So these afflictive emotions are our enemy, in the sense that we say that say greed or jealousy. These are afflictive emotions. The difference, of course, is that just like with the viruses are our creation. I don't mean in a literal sense whether it came out of the Chinese lab or they didn't. The viruses are an outcome of what we as a species have become. And today, the crisis that we confront is really a crisis of the species. It is no longer a crisis of the individual. I think COVID teaches us that, the environment teaches that, and the certain patterns of authoritarianism that you see in many parts of the world teaches that. So it is a more deeper manifestation and expression of not just interdependence, but also interconnectedness. I mean, there's a subtle nuance between being connected and dependent. And that's where we get stuck in verbal gymnastics. So I think if we look at viruses as a consequence of who we are as a species, then of course we have to treat them in a functional sense as enemies, but at the same time with courtesy and respect, as a product of who we are, and then see ways in which we can get our act together as a species, so that whether it is environment, whether it is the virus, whether it is lifestyle diseases that are overwhelming us, heart attacks are growing, cancer is growing, and so it's that interconnectedness that we have to recognize and embrace. And that's I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you.
Certainly.
May I ask a question, Mr.
Yes.
Makeja?
Yes, please do.
VP Raja here.
Yeah.
At a certain period,
He's our
of Indian-
scientist, Rajiv.
Gigi, my goodness, yes.
in a certain period of Indian history, there have been a lot of debate over 300 years or so between Hinduism and Buddhism. It's stated that Pali was the language of the Buddhists, Sanskrit was the language of the Hindus, and that's when the Shankaracharyas, so to say, at that period, won the battle, and literally Buddhism became marginalized. What really was the nature of that debate, which took place in India for perhaps a few centuries?
Well, from one of the great challenges that the Buddha was trying to respond to was the moving away from the need for a mediator between man and himself, in a sense, because he didn't reject. He just said, we do not have the time or the space, or since we cannot resolve it, whether there is a God or not, let's just put it aside. And I'm not a sort of a profound scholar of history, but sort of common wisdom has taught us that it was really the power structures, and ultimately it usually is a struggle for power, that the traditional belief system and structures of Brahmanism and of the religion as it was practiced felt threatened by Buddhism's sort of very inclusive nature and its sort of agnostic worldview. And I had this question as to why is it that you have people waging wars? I mean, look at what's happening in Burma. Look what happened in Sri Lanka. And so I think just like not every terrorist is a Muslim, and not every Muslim is a terrorist, So I would look at these as sort of aberrations of Buddhism, that there are people who are waging war in them. And Hinduism, as I like to see it, I'm a disciple, my first sort of journey and entry point into the quest was to the Ramakrishna mission. And I don't know how many people are aware that Sri Ramakrishna himself was considered an avatar. And what did he do? As once he became a pujari, he engaged in the rituals and practices first of the diversity of Hindu traditions, Dvait, Advait, even Tantra from a woman, a male priest in full public view. Then what did he do? He steps out of the temple precincts and engages in the practice of Islam. And then of Christianity. And, I've done a biography of Ramakrishna, and I'm as a disciple of Ramakrishna, I gave it to the monks to read. And the only correction they wanted to make was that I had said he ate beef. And they said, well, why raise a controversy? Can we just change it and say he ate the diet of a Muslim? That is, to me, the fundamental inclusive nature of the Hindu tradition. And you look at many of the recent avatars. You look at Ramana Maharishi. People of all hues went there. And he spoke through his presence. I mean, he had these long periods of silence. You look at Aurobindo. I mean, look at all the contemporary spiritual masters who were responding to the accumulated challenge of divisiveness. And it is like this, it is like the rope and the snake. I mean, it depends on how you look at the rope. When you look at a snake, it's a snake. So I feel that conflict was totally unnecessary. However, I do want to pick up, and time is running out, on a very important principle of, again, Buddhism, and that is debate. And seminal to Buddhist training, mind training, certainly in the Mahayana tradition, is debate. And why do they debate? And what do they do in debate? This is what emerged from the Nalanda tradition. And in the Nalanda tradition, you had people of all traditions and all faiths. So if you had a Dharmakriti or you had a Buddhist scholar, and he came up with a point of view, he had to engage in debate with the community at Nalanda. And it was not debating in the sense of the West practices that, I take position A and you take position B. What happens is, I don't know if you've seen any Tibetan monks debate, they do this. And this movement is the sword of Manjushri cutting through the veils of ignorance. So in rotation, they rapidly switch points of view so that they so deeply internalize contradictory impulses while remaining true to their own enterprise. That, for me, is the essence. I would say, I've only just begun to reread Shankara, and I have great respect. Why it had to become a conflictual relationship that I am superior.
I am not seeing that.
I have no idea.
My presence is
Please, please watch the noise behind you, each one. Okay. Anybody else coming in? Jambu, do you have a question? And then Pushkala. Okay, says Jambu is ceding the space. Pushkala, go ahead.
It's a question of a few parts. So you've had me thinking deeply. Thank you, Rajiv ji. The first thing I wanted to say is I was drawn to two words that you used, secular and inclusive. And wearing the hat of a grandmother, I'm concerned about our future generations who are going to be global citizens. And both these facets, both these qualities are very important, while spiritual growth is, a cognizant part of one's life, cognitive part of one's life. Because otherwise you tend, in order to merge with the masses, you drop your Hinduism. These days it's not even a good word. So my question was about what is the root into it. The second part of my question was to do with, I hear about lots of friends going and doing Vipassana courses like people do yoga sessions. What is your take on that? Is that a valid step towards Buddhism? Can one encounter this? And the third part of my question is, does Buddhism treat men and women equally? Like we've had the Janeu for my grandson. I can't do it for my granddaughter. And that makes me feel that somewhere something is missing. So please throw some light on this.
Well, I have to say that, we tend to use, I certainly have used the word secular very loosely. And when we have, when this conversation were to happen in the United States, we would not use the word secular, because that would immediately create unrest and chaos, as it would now do in India, because in the American Constitution, even silence in a school is seen to be compromising its basic secular principles. I know the Transcendental Meditation initiative and many efforts to introduce that, creates difficulties and challenges. So we usually prefer saying celebrating diversity. I think that's more appropriate. As far as women is concerned, it remains an extremely difficult and challenging issue for the Buddhist community. There are, from the Buddha's time, in fact, the perhaps concerned about what the presence of women alongside the monks might do to the monks. So he enabled the ordination of women, but they were not really equal in stature. I'm not sure I would say that equal in terms of their spiritual growth and evolution, but certainly were not treated that way. In recent times, that in many communities you do have women nuns, and the Dalai Lama has taken in the last sort of 20, 30 years some very definitive and decisive steps to address this issue. And people often misunderstand. They sort of think that the Dalai Lama may be somewhat like the Vatican, that he can decree what it is, or what needs to be done. So he can only recommend and try and build a consensus. So he did build a consensus. And in about 6-7 years ago, the first batch of what they called Geshe Mas have emerged, who have had the same training and the same qualifications as the monks, and are at least have the Dalai Lama's mandate to teach and function equally with the monks. Now, and he has tried to build a consensus in the community, so he managed it with the other monks and the religious leadership within Tibetan Buddhism. But ultimately, this will only work if the community is able to embrace it and has the comfort level, and that will take time. And unfortunately, the Dalai Lamas have single lifetimes, and I think that this will take a lot of time. And within the Tibetan community, I think I see far more equality, and equality is a terrible word, but let's say dignity and role and space for Tibetan women. So it is far more actively a work in progress today than in virtually any other faith or tradition that I know. But it is a work in progress, and His Holiness has committed himself. He's sort of put his himself and who he is on the line. But it will really depend on how the larger social environment responds to that and picks it up. As we well know in India, that you can make laws and legislation, but that really doesn't achieve what I would imagine you and I would really like to see. I think the other question is even more difficult, because it is really a commentary on what other people and other traditions and practitioners are doing. As far as Vipassana is concerned, I have to say, that we've had Mr. Goenka and his Vipassana, which His Holiness has invited him to the community, to the monasteries. He has given the monks instruction in Vipassana. And as far as that particular school, the SN Goenka school of Vipassana, I can say with confidence that it is integral part of Buddhist practice, and at least a very important preliminary to the subsequent practices that come after you have trained, which is a very necessary prerequisite, and it's a very important way of achieving that, and that is concentration and awareness. But as far as the other traditions are concerned, it's very hard to comment on their legitimacy. And as the Buddha said, we must subject all of these to reason, logic, and our experience. And certainly I would question anybody or any tradition that promises you the instant variety, weekend courses to enlightenment, week-long courses to past life therapy. They are inherently suspicious. I hope that makes some sense.
Certainly, thank you so much. Yes, Jambu?
So you're on.
Jamburathan, unmute yourself. You need your wife again to help you here.
Am I okay?
Yes.
Yes,
you're
we
okay
can
now.
help.
Here?
Yes.
Is ahimsa a core principle of Buddhism? If not, what is the answer to meet the challenge of violence, which we find throughout the world? And I had put one question: countries which are Hindu earlier in Southeast Asia, including Vietnam, Indonesia, and Bali, etc., they all become Islamic because they could not meet the violent attacks. Hinduism became Buddhism, then Buddhism became Islam. I mean, I'm over generalizing, but that's the impression. What is the principle of meeting violence? Now Tibet is facing violence from China. What is the answer to that? Now India has suffered by too much adhering to ahimsa. Now they are arming themselves, trying to meet a challenge. Where does it lead to? Thank you.
Gosh, I would have to be Mahatma Gandhi, the Dalai Lama, and I mean a whole Nelson Mandela and a whole range of people rolled into one to be able to give you the answer. What I can sort of, by way of comment, is point out that His Holiness has committed himself to a non-violent response. People within the community have argued that it may not have been the best approach in his case, and for Tibetan Buddhism, as I pointed out, everything depends on your motivation. And so, a common example that His Holiness often gives, that there is a caravan going through Tibet, and there are a monk discovers that there is a thief who is armed in the caravan, and in order to save the lives of the rest of the caravan, he decides to take on the negative karma of violence in order to kill the thief. So it depends on the motivation behind violence. And I think even Gandhiji had not urged universal non-violence against, it would depend on the nature of the enemy and the motivation behind it. And the same thing with non-violence, that if non-violence isn't practiced with the motivation and the genuine respect for the enemy, it will be counterproductive. So these are subtle and complex values that circumscribe and lie behind violence, non-violence. And we can get caught in the rhetoric of, or to the encapsulated ideas of what is non-violence. And we know, for example, that non-violence isn't the absence of violence. It is something far more complex and nuanced, and determination. And what's very important to recognize is that people weren't just non-violence who were working with Gandhiji. They were trained in non-violence. So they had to nurture and cultivate that quality of non-violence. So you see these familiar movie images of, the British, Indians under the British, beating up these followers of Gandhi, and they just don't respond. Now that takes a great deal of training and practice. So it's not just something you say, I'm going to refrain from violence because that is an abstract or tangible virtue. It is located in the context, in the manner in which it is practiced. And both violence legitimate violence and legitimate non-violence call for very deep personal transformations and nurturing of values that you have to cultivate before you go out and do that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Is there anybody else? Yes. Yes, Dasgupta. Unmute yourself. Unmute yourself. Bambu, you have to unmute yourself.
I'm trying
Yes.
to.
No, not yet. You're still mute. What's the problem, Bambu? Yes, now.
Yeah. Rajiv ji, thank you very much for a absolutely fascinating talk. I have gathered a somewhat contradictory takeaways from the talk, which is perhaps my own misfortune. I did get the point that in the ultimate analysis, it is the individual's search for reality or truth through his own perspective, through his vision, till ultimately he comes to a satisfactory conclusion that yes, this is the ultimate reality, and which may differ from the reality of somebody else. At the same time, Buddha himself said, not only Buddham Sharanam Gacchami, but also Dhammam Sharanam Gacchami and Sangham Sharanam Gacchami. Are these necessarily correlated, or are these steps towards ultimately an individual reaching the truth or the reality? Thank you.
Well, the Buddha is the Buddha, but there is no singular Buddha. The Buddha is a state of being. And so the Buddha is, in a sense, an honorific. So it's like we say someone, Padma Bhushan. So there are many Buddhas. There are many Buddhas amongst us. Some of them are acknowledged, others are not. So a Buddha is an awakened one who has seen the true nature of reality. And you know, the oxymoron really is that when we say true nature of reality, we're simultaneously saying there is no singular reality. So in a sense, the true nature of reality is that there is no singular nature of reality. I think there's often confusion and ambivalence about that, or facets of that. And you know, the Sangha was an extremely important element in practical terms. And what many of us, people like myself who are struggling practitioner, lack is the true Sangha. And I would just share an aside that which you might find interesting, that when Swami Vivekananda decided that he would set up the Ramakrishna mission to honor his master, he went into deep meditation on the Buddha. And he said that the Buddha is my Ishta and the Ramakrishna is my master. And so what was so amazing within the Ramakrishna mission itself was that here was a disciple of a bhakta willing to embrace an agnostic. So what often appears contradictory at a more subtle, nuanced level may not be so. I mean, I've not reached those levels of experience that I can talk about my experience with these things. I'm just a struggling aspirant, but I learn from, say, a position that Swami Vivekananda took. But what was even more interesting was that from his meditation, the model of the Ramakrishna mission today is based entirely on the Buddhist model of the Sangha. As the Buddha recommended it. Now, when Buddhism traveled to Tibet, there were different structures. You know, it was a sparsely populated land, 6 million people in land area the size of much of North India. So the monastic institutions became more or less autonomous, and by consensus, the different monks had greater influence or lesser influence. Now, how is the Sangha of the Ramakrishna mission structured? It is democratic, it is completely decentralized, and much abused word, it is secular. Historically, some of it has been diluted now, particularly in India, which is, I don't want to get into the reasons for that. They celebrate Christmas, They celebrate the religion, they celebrate festivals of all traditions. So we have to be careful when we refer to the Sangha as to what is the Sangha. We see it alive. Interestingly, when we were talking about why Shankara came in and why Buddhism, Buddhist law, because of the Ramakrishna mission. That is not one of the Buddha Sangha. And there was a question, and perhaps I will conclude with that I think Makhijaji asked, is to the future of the institution of the Dalai Lama. And I just want to share a few comments on that because it is very revealing. So what Tenzin Gyatso currently holds the office of the Dalai Lama, believes to be a reincarnation of the Buddha in the form of the Buddha Avalokiteshvara, compassion. So the primary teaching of the Dalai Lama, and I haven't had the time or the space to talk about it, is nurturing compassion. Now he's asked this question that what is going to happen after you? He's 87 years old. And historically, when the Dalai Lama moves on to the heavenly fields, he leaves behind some signals and some pointers as to where the next Dalai Lama or the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama will be found. Now, His Holiness's position has been that I, Tenzin Gyatso, will take rebirth in order to teach and serve humanity. That is what distinguishes the Mahayana tradition from the Hinayana tradition. One isn't better or worse than the other. So in the Mahayana tradition, the aspiration of Buddhist practice is to be able to steer your consciousness at the time of death to take rebirth in human form and the suffering of the human condition in order to teach and serve humanity. So that is the degree to which you're willing to put the sense of self aside and manifest altruism and compassion. So he, Tenzin Gyatso, will take rebirth to do that. But whether he does that in the context of the institution of the Dalai Lama will depend on whether it is useful or not. And he will take that call before he leaves his body and let us know. So there is no political, the Chinese are bound to prop up someone, but we will have a signal from His Holiness as to whether he intended to reappear or not. So this gives us an insight into so many elements: reincarnation, the power of compassion. And I am disappointed that I didn't dwell on that at all. And that you have the degree of your compassion is that you give up the aspiration of moksha and choose to be reborn, as avatars do. So when avatars are reborn, they go through the suffering. Look at Ramakrishna suffering with cancer. Even Ramana Maharishi had cancer. So how much these people suffer? They embrace it. Why do they come? Because they're driven by this passion for compassion to teach and serve humanity. And that ultimately is what the spiritual quest is about. How can we make other people happy to the degree that we're willing to embrace the human condition? That is the ultimate. I hope that
Okay, Rajivji, I think there is nothing more to be said after that. I think we'll close the questions. And you have far exceeded the expectations of this assembly. It's been a wonderful experience. And you say you are a student, but you are an advanced student. Some of us are just beginning students. And do let us know if it's possible for us to access some of the resources at the foundation to understand the Dalai Lama Foundation's view of or creed of Buddhism, if it can be accessed by any open source, etc. We'll be happy to pursue this inquiry further with that. And of course, we'll get in touch with you in the future again, because I'm sure that you can guide us on many other subjects also. I'm also equally grateful to Meenakshi ji, who has also been present throughout this session. It's been a wonderful experience. We are all blessed. Thank you very much.
If I could make a closing comment, I too
Please.
am deeply grateful to Meenakshi.
Okay.
for being by his side through this enterprise. And on this aspect of being an advanced student, I have to tell you a small story. And it was many years ago. I'd written a book called The Mind of the Guru.
Yeah.
And His Holiness very kindly agreed to bless it and release the book. And so I was in seventh heaven because there was a stunning photograph of His Holiness here, the book in the middle, and me next to it. And so when his turn came to speak, and in typical style, he said, Rajiv has been an old student of mine and he works very hard. How much he knows, I don't know. So I want to leave you with that thought. Don't take anything I've said too seriously.
Thank you very much. I think that's a wonderful ending on a subject on which nobody knows. So,